Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the second week of vaccine. The course is rapidly going by. We had a fantastic session on Saturday morning, and today we are joined by two very special guests to talk to us about something that I think has been one of the most widely debated and discussed topics of the pandemic and of the vaccination campaign, the impact of social media. So, first of all, we have with us Lindsay Aloya, Associate Professor of Communication and Director for the Center for Communication Research at the U of A. She holds a PhD from Penn State and is the recipient of a long list of awards for someone so early in their career, including the U of A's Master Researcher Award and the Southern Communication Association's Janice Hocker-Rushing Early Career Research Award. Her research focuses on elucidating the causes and consequences of verbal aggression in interpersonal associations. Specifically, she focuses on how qualities of interpersonal interactions as well as individuals shape the uses and reactions to verbally aggressive experiences, highly relevant to today's topic, sadly. Secondly, we have with us Dean Brian Primack. He is the Dean of the College of Education and Health Professions at the U of A and the Henry G. Hotz Endowed Chair in Educational Innovations and Professor of Public Health and Professor of Medicine at the University of Arkansas for Medical Sciences. He holds a PhD from the University of Pittsburgh, an MD from Emory University, and an EDM from the Graduate School of Education at Harvard University. At Pitt, he was Vice Chancellor for Research on Health and Society and founding director of the Center for Research on Media, Technology, and Health. His research is focused on interrelationships between media, technology, health, both physical and mental. His research into alternative tobacco products such as electronic cigarettes and hookahs has informed the public debate and shaped public policy, and he has studied social media interactions and mental health incomes. And above all, what Dean Kuhn would want me to say is that he was, before coming here, the third dean of Pitt's Honors College. So we have two fantastic presenters today. Dean Linda Kuhn sends her regrets as she is with library search candidates today, but I think we will have a fantastic session, and I turn it over to our presenters.
All right, so I'm going to start, but before I get cruising, just as a disclaimer, I'm home, as you can see, and I have 3 small dogs, all of whom get very excited when I am on a Zoom call. So should you hear any barking, that's my pups, and I will try to quiet them as soon as possible. Thank you so much, Dr. Treat, for the kind introduction. As mentioned, my name is Dr. Aloya, and I am thrilled to be here today with Dean Primack to talk to you about social media in relation to the COVID-19 pandemic. So in ancient Greece, citizens met in what was called the agora, which is a public space in the center of a city typically. And it was a place to gather to talk about economics, politics, to engage in social events. And the agora also served to kind of centralize business. So it brought people to one location to be able to talk, to browse, to shop, to get to know one another, to share public opinion. Accordingly, things like forums have long existed. Today, however, much of these forums exist digitally. And of course, the pandemic has accelerated social media relevance to no longer just be a guilty pleasure, but something of a kind of contemporary necessity. So the days when we regard social media as this indulgence or a bad habit, sometimes described as a generational flaw, those days are essentially gone. Instead, it's become one of the most integral aspects of modern society, particularly during a pandemic, when many of our real-world face-to-face forums have disappeared. When the opportunity to meet, like the Greeks once did, in the agora is no longer available. According to a recent study, 3.484 billion people actively use social media. And that's about 45% of the world's population. Where are people going? They're spending their time on sites like YouTube, Reddit, Twitch, Tumblr. And to start today's conversation, I want to talk about three of the more popular social media platforms, namely Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. So despite ongoing controversies and ever emerging competition, Facebook is still the most used and engaged social media platform with about 2.7 billion monthly active users. So Facebook allows you, as most of you probably know, to create a profile page to reveal some information about yourself. Facebook users can post text, photos, multimedia, which is then shared with whoever they themselves have decided to share that content with, often agreed to be friends. There's also instant messaging capabilities through Facebook platform. The largest group of Facebook users is actually 25 to 34-year-olds. So the notion that the younger crowd has kind of abandoned Facebook actually isn't true. However, there is an influx of boomers to Facebook. 44% of users are female and 56% of users identify as male. How many of you are active on Facebook? If you could just raise your hand, you could turn your camera on and raise your hand, or just raise your hand. Okay, so really quick, if you could just take, thanks Janine, if you could take your cell phones out. If you have the Facebook app, you can open it. And when you get there, you're going to hit the three lines in the bottom right-hand corner of your app. After you hit that, you're going to click on Settings and Privacy. And then Your Time on Facebook. Then you should see a white box come up that says Your Time. Does everybody see that? Click that. What is your average time spent on Facebook? You can type it in the chat or you can unmute yourselves. Talk with me. "12 minutes a day." Thanks, Sarah. "14 minutes a day." "1 minute." Hey, listen, you don't have to apologize here for not using Facebook. So we're seeing kind of a big range based on the people who are participating today, all the way from 1 hour or more to 1 minute or less. According to Facebook data, we've learned that people spend approximately 38 minutes a day on Facebook. So due to Facebook's sheer size and engagement rate, it really has remained a social media staple. How many of you are on Instagram? So just about the same crew that was on Facebook seemed to also be on Instagram. And Instagram's steady growth is actually well documented and has served to cement it as the second largest network of social media after Facebook, with 1 billion monthly active users. So Instagram, for those who don't know, allows users to post this square image or videos with some text to a personal page. Similar to Facebook, there are also messaging capabilities through Instagram and stories, which are accessible to users for only 24 hours. Akin to Facebook, the largest age group is again 25 to 34-year-olds. This is surprising given that Instagram actually had incredibly popular growth initially for much younger users. But unfortunately for Instagram, the platform is facing fierce competition from other social media sites like TikTok and other applications like Snapchat. 57% of Instagram users are female and 43% of users identify as male. Recent Instagram statistics also highlight the importance and relevance of influencers for shaping public opinion. So back in ancient Greece, when individuals gathered in person in those city centers or agoras, they would describe these people as opinion leaders, right? Someone who interprets messaging or content for other individuals, someone who diffuses ideas or disperses ways of thinking. And sometimes these people happen to be experts in a field, but other times they just happen to be the loudest voice in the room. As the title suggests, influencers have social influence. And because Facebook and Instagram share ad platforms, influencers on both of those sites have the ability to influence on both. Finally, Twitter's usage, user base, and growth have been fairly consistent year to year, with now approximately 187 million monthly active users. And the platform's pretty straightforward. It allows for posts including 280 characters or less. And this tends to signal to users that it's a place to gather quick sound bites of news or share content. Twitter users are older than Facebook and Instagram users on average, with the largest age group being 30 to 49-year-olds. And very interestingly, something that I've only recently realized is that Twitter is actually male dominated. 68% of Twitter users are male, with only 32% of users identifying as female. People, as you might expect, spend significantly less time on Twitter, with an average session being about 3.5 minutes. Similar to Instagram, though, there is an immense amount of value placed on influencers. In fact, 80% of all tweets come from 10% of the platform's most active accounts, suggesting that not only is there a lot of influence, but that it has become more challenging for corporate advertising to find their niche on Twitter. Who do you think some of the most powerful influencers are on Twitter? Who do you think are people with the most followers? Again, you can unmute yourselves or you can type that in the chat. Kevin Liu thinks he is. Trump, celebrities and politicians. Have any guess on what celebrities or politicians? Yeah, Sarah's actually absolutely correct. So the most followed person currently on Twitter is President Barack Obama. Any other guesses? Any celebrities that you think might have a particularly powerful voice on Twitter? Oh, Ariana Grande. You're absolutely right, Isabella. Ariana is in the top 10. Other celebrities, yep, Kim Kardashian is also up there with some of the most followers. Others include Justin Bieber, Katy Perry, Rihanna, Taylor Swift, Lady Gaga. And fascinatingly, YouTube has one of the most active Twitters. So we also see some cross-pollination here when it comes to social media. So how do these platforms like Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, how do they influence our experience of the COVID-19 pandemic? Well, the first article that you were all asked to review was titled The COVID-19 Social Media Infodemic, and that discussed the diffusion of information around the COVID-19 pandemic through a massive data analysis. And then the second article that you were asked to review was titled Mental Health Toll from the Coronavirus, which investigated the associations between social media usage and mental health during the COVID-19 pandemic. So I'm actually going to start with that first article, and then I'm going to turn it over to Dean Primack to review the second. So the first article, the COVID-19 Social Media Infodemic. At this point, you're super familiar with COVID-19, and we also now just briefly discussed social media. But what is an infodemic? So it was a term coined to describe kind of these perils of misinformation that happen during the management of a disease outbreak. So it's like one of those spiral cycles of rumors. And it can spread particularly quickly online given this new information environment of social media. So how does that happen? Well, part of the problem is that most of social media content is user generated. But it also is, to many people, a source of news, a place to consume, to discover, to share, to repost, or to comment on news, on what is contemporaneously happening in the world. The problem is that a lot of the users who are generating the content are doing so without any sort of professional journalistic background. So in 2019, the Pew Research Center found that half of Americans, somewhere around 54%, either got their news as they report sometimes or often from social media. And who is it coming from? Well, we just talked about who has the most popular Twitter accounts. I mean, it's coming from celebrities, it's coming from influencers most often, who are not always the most reliable or credible sources of information. So the authors of the article that you read examined social dynamics through narratives on social media related to the COVID-19 pandemic. Specifically, they looked at more than 8 million comments and posts over a 45-day period on 5 different social media platforms. So they looked at Instagram and Twitter, also YouTube, which are 3 very popular mainstream social media platforms where content is restricted by the sites themselves. And then they also looked at Reddit and Gab, which are 2 less popular, less restrictive social media platforms. So where was the highest volume of interaction occurring centered around the COVID-19 pandemic? Well, as expected, it was happening on the more popular sites. So the mainstream platforms that have a bit more restriction on the content posted, that's where the content was being posted most often. That's where engagement and activity was happening most frequently. Reddit and Gab, where there is less control and more polarized voices, actually had less content related to the COVID-19 pandemic. How were people engaging in the content? Well, similarly to what I'm sure you all do when you engage with social media content, there's liking, right, where there's no original production of information. And then there's commenting or posting themselves, which is actually the creation or generation of information, which then is published for other users' consumptions. So what were people talking about? As you can see in figure 1 on page 3 of your document, People were talking about all kinds of things related to the pandemic. They were looking up things like death tolls and infection rates. They were investigating government decision making. They were having a lot of conversations about the Diamond Princess, which was the cruise ship that departed from China that initially accounted for more than half of the reported cases of COVID-19. People were discussing the economic impact. Something that surprised me, that I wonder if also surprised you, was how infrequently users actually discuss the disease itself. The description of the disease or the symptom of the disease didn't actually present as a common topic on either Gab or Instagram, which might be related to the style of post for the social media site. Was there anything that surprised you all when you looked at the top topics that people were talking about? Everything else felt predictable. I was also surprised to see how much prayer and thoughtfulness related to like individual contact was happening on social media. But again, it might be a byproduct of the sites with which the researchers were looking at. As expected, posts increased as time went on. So as we learned more about the COVID-19 pandemic, as we were stuck at home longer as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, we see this kind of fairly steady linear growth. There are some pockets where things flatten off a bit, but generally we see this kind of linear trajectory where more posts over more time. So what I was most excited to look at in this article was, is the information that is being shared actually reliable information? So how did the researchers go about actually answering this question? Well, they hired an independent fact-checking organization to tag posts as either reliable or questionable based on available data. So questionable information included posts that had extreme bias, that were consistent in the promotion of any kind of propaganda or conspiracy theories, that had poor or no source credibility, that lacked supporting evidence or any sort of verifiable evidence, and then that just was not transparent. And on mainstream social media, questionable posts actually represented a small fraction of the posts produced. The article goes on to mention that the most problematic of all sites was Gab, and even in Gab, 70% of the posts were deemed to be reliable. However, fascinatingly, the volume of reaction is actually 3 times larger for questionable posts as compared to reliable posts. So I don't know much about the social networking site Gab, or I should say I didn't know much about the social networking site Gab. But after some digging, I realized that it's really only about 100,000 active users a month. A number of people have accessed Gab, but reliable users is actually quite small. And while it is susceptible to misinformation dissemination, I feel a little bit better knowing that the reach of Gab is significantly smaller than sites like Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter. So I recognize that the global spread of information poses a really serious problem for public health, especially in the context of COVID-19, but surprisingly, questionable content, like I said, makes up an actually small percentage of overall content on the topic and is found, thank goodness, less frequently on mainstream media, social media platforms than more mainstream platforms themselves. Unfortunately, it's not all good news. And I'm going to turn it over to Dean Primack to be the one to deliver the subpart news as it relates to COVID-19 and mental health.
Okay, can everybody hear me okay? Okay. I am going to share my screen. Okay, you guys can see that okay? Okay, super. Still not entirely used to doing this, without people right in front of me. However, thank you, Dr. Aloya, for getting us started and talking about social media in general, and then starting to link that to COVID-19. And I'm actually I noticed that a lot of people have questions, specific questions about mental health. And so I'm going to sort of punt that a little bit more to the question and answer period to get people's particular, thoughts and questions about that. And I'm going to focus on the infodemic, what today's lecture or today's session is about, but also on just sort of the general health ideas and vaccine hesitancy, which is probably the biggest issue in the news right now, and the biggest issue when it comes to actually figuring out what's going to happen in the future. So vaccines have been the subject of controversy for a long time. Here is Elvis Presley in the 1950s promoting a vaccination against polio, which was a deadly virus at the time, and a lot of people were not getting vaccinated for it. And so we are going to talk a little bit about COVID, but also a little bit about other history that sort of, I think, helps us understand why we are where we are. So we're going to talk, this is basically the 5 things I'm going to touch on. Let's start with the infodemic. So as we heard before, the infodemic comes from 2 words, information and epidemic. And if you think about it, information spreads even more quickly, especially in today's world, than the virus can. So, you can sort of imagine the way Dr. Aloya was saying in the Agora in Greece. It was a marketplace, and which is, by the way, when people are afraid to go out of their house, it's called agoraphobia, because they are afraid of the marketplace. This is, a diagnosable condition in mental health. So in the Agora, people would, hear information from each other, and then that information, might get spread to their communities. But in today's world, through Instagram and Facebook and Twitter, and like we heard about from Dr. Aloya, as well as other means, we're able to process all of this much, much more quickly, and it's able to spread in. All of a sudden, instead of physical spread, it's digital spread. Now, and some of that is information that is, sort of correct information, but then some of it is misinformation or disinformation. And those are actually 2 different things. So misinformation is information that isn't correct, but there's no actual sort of malicious intent. So if I tell you that the party is at 8 o'clock when really it's at 7 o'clock, but I just forgot what time it was, then I'm giving you misinformation. But if, like, I don't want you to come to the party because I don't like you, and I tell you that it's at 11, and that's disinformation. There I'm doing something for profit or for power or something like that. So this is just sort of a linguistic thing that I think is important to think about as we are looking at different pieces of information that we find and trying to figure out, is this information? Is it misinformation? Is it disinformation? And we can't always figure it all out. So one of the reasons why there has been so much misinformation, again, not malicious, but still not necessarily correct information, is because things change so much. So here is a headline from the Washington Post at the beginning of the pandemic in January of 2020, saying, the grip spelled like this means kind of flu. So that's why they're saying, get a grip, America. The flu is a much bigger health threat than coronavirus for now. And obviously, that's not the way it turned out. We're looking at about 600,000 American deaths. How many people die from the flu every year? Well, it's this. So in 2019 to 20, that flu season, 22,000 Americans died from the flu. People are usually surprised by how high these numbers are. In 2017-18, it was actually a pretty bad year, and 61,000 people died from the flu. Well, at this particular time in history, they were expecting only a few thousand American deaths. And so, even though this is misinformation in retrospect, that it probably was sort of accurate at the time. Another example is that early on, the CDC said, if you are not sick, you do not need to wear a face mask. Right? And in fact, face masks may be in short supply and they should be saved for caregivers. So if you're wearing a face mask, that's bad. And then, of course, that became reversed after we got more information. And this happens in medicine all the time. On my first day of medical school, the dean gave us a big presentation and said, unfortunately, about half of what we teach you is wrong. We just don't know which half it is. And sure enough, we learned that, you really should give hormone replacement therapy to women who are postmenopausal. Well, now that's malpractice because it causes strokes. We learned that we did learn about coronavirus. It was a harmless, minor cause of the common cold. And we all know how that worked out. So things change in health and medicine, which is why there can be misinformation and why it's very, very easy for people to take something like this and say, okay, all doctors are wrong about everything, because here is a piece of information that then later was changed. And then there's all kinds of information about conspiracy theories, et cetera, et cetera. I found this headline very interesting from NBC News because you can see they don't say cell phone data links COVID to Wuhan lab. It says report says that cell phone data suggests that there was an October shutdown maybe at Wuhan lab, but experts are skeptical. So somehow in this one headline, they're able to couch it 3 times. Report says. I'm not saying it. It's the report. It's not me. It suggests it. Doesn't say anything for real. Oh, but experts are skeptical. And so this is the kind of push-pull that we always have when we are trying to report things and when we are trying to report things accurately. But, it's not that disinformation. It's not, malicious NBC News is trying to, cause a problem. They're trying to say, well, how do we say this? Okay. So with that background of, how much information there is and how easily it can get misinterpreted, let me just talk to you a little bit about vaccines. You're going to probably learn much more in this course. And if some of this is duplicating, I think that's fine. So, before 2020, there wasn't a whole lot of, problems with vaccines, right? Like the 10 threats to global health that was published in 2019, right? That was like, poverty, and that was, climate change and other things like that, right? Well, yes, it was those things, but vaccine avoidance was near the top of the list in 2019 before all of COVID. And there's an entire field in public health where we just talk about vaccine acceptance as one of the biggest health problems in the world. And it's not just some people refuse all vaccines and some people accept all vaccines. There's mostly a whole bunch of people in the middle. Well, mostly I accept, but geez, I'm not entirely sure. Or, well, I'll get it, but I'm going to delay some. I'm going to refuse, I probably will refuse, but I am unsure. And, I'm potentially, so this is an example of something that was, discussed and, talked about in public health well before, coronavirus. So let me give you an example of why that, it is an issue. Okay, so I'm going to share a different screen with you now. There we go. Okay, you guys able to see this? Okay. So we have a measles simulator. And what this measles simulator does is basically we are going to choose, let's choose Arkansas. And you can go ahead and do this. You can go to fred.publichealth.pit.edu/measles. You can pick your own hometown in Louisiana or whatever, but let's go ahead and do Arkansas. And let's select, we're gonna select Little Rock, okay? And then I'll also show you Fayetteville. And what we're gonna see is on the left is a simulation of if 80% of people get vaccinated against measles. And on the right is a simulation of if 95% of people get vaccinated against measles. And what the purpose of this is to show you where we get this idea of herd immunity. Okay, so let's look at Little Rock. Boom. Okay. Day 42, 48, 54. A red dot indicates a case. A blue dot indicates a recovered case. Now, the blue dot could also indicate that the person died because measles does have a pretty significant mortality rate. So at the end of not even a year, if 80% of people in this county were vaccinated against measles, this is how many measles cases there would have been. On the right side is 95% coverage. And you see there were a couple of cases, but they both went away. And by the way, this is kind of like what, our measles vaccination rate used to be much higher than that. I'm going to show you in just a moment that measles is now on the rise. And we thought that it was basically gone, but it's not. But this is the difference of why we talk about this idea of herd immunity, that, in this case, when 20% of people have not been vaccinated, then those people are contagious for that much longer. Let me go ahead and just show you Fayetteville. And it's different every time because it's all using, statistical information. And you see that there were a few cases here, but those people just didn't become in proximity to other unvaccinated people. Whereas look at what happens on day 144, 46, 48, 52, if we have only 80% of people who are vaccinated. This is where this whole idea comes from about how critical it is that as many people as possible get vaccinated. So I'm going to stop that share and I'm going to go back to where I was. And feel free to look at that more if you want. There is the there is the URL if you want. And what this 70% is here to remind me is that right now, about 70% of kids get all their required vaccinations. So that's a big deal in the medical world because people don't remember what a lot of these diseases were like. So why does this happen? Why is this number only 70%? What's going on with COVID, et cetera, et cetera? Well, people are over time less and less believing in vaccines. You can see around 20 years ago, the numbers were, in the mid 90s, early to mid 90s. The lowest belief in vaccines was among males, and high school graduate or lower. And you can see that over the following 15 years, those numbers have gone down substantially and then stayed about the same over the last several years. And because of how fine those differences are that we just learned about in terms of herd immunity, even a 5 to 10% change like this is important. So why does this happen? And then we also see this really interesting stat. And again, this was a survey done in 2019. And about 45% of people said they were unsure if vaccines cause autism. And only 10% of people said, yes, they do. And 45% of people, so people were about the same, geez, I'm not really sure if they do or not, or they don't. And this is what has happened with regard to measles cases. We saw that during this period, because of the lowering of herd immunity, all of a sudden there were 667 cases, and by the way, before this, there had been almost zero. Measles had basically been eradicated in the United States. And measles was this horrible thing, brain damage and, and death, et cetera, et cetera. And all of a sudden, and it was eradicated. And then all of a sudden it sort of came back. Then there was another information campaign, but then there was another sort of disinformation campaign. And this is what we saw in 2019. And we're still figuring out the numbers for 2020. But in the New York Times, there was an article in 2020 that said that the World Health Organization and the CDC says that measles deaths soared not just in the United States, but worldwide last year. Okay, so why does this happen? Well, I think it's important to say that this has been around for a long time. Okay, this is smallpox, and vaccination started with smallpox. I am sorry this is so ugly, but this was actually the most pleasant picture I could put up, believe it or not. If you go ahead and Google smallpox images, you'll see why I didn't put up some of the other ones. Okay, so smallpox was in the 1700s in the United States, a real problem. Okay, and before smallpox, there was no such thing as vaccination. And how, a lot of people talk about how Cotton Mather, this dude in 1706, became interested in vaccination. Now, interestingly, there's two things about that are, I think, sort of, noteworthy. One is he was also the Salem witch trials guy. So that's just, a little sideline. And number two is he had no idea in 1706. It was Onesimus who taught him about vaccination. Now, who was Onesimus? Well, we don't know Onesimus's real name because Onesimus was a West African slave. And when Cotton Mather owned this slave, and Cotton Mather was having all these people die of smallpox and get disfigured from smallpox. And this slave said, well, you know what we used to do over in West Africa was we would take a little piece of the disease and we would actually, give it to people who were healthy. And then that would help them and they wouldn't get sick. We noticed this. And we don't even know the name of this person who basically saved the United States from, being destroyed. The reason he gave him the name Onesimus is because that is it is a New Testament name for what somebody named their slave. Okay, so then we get to the first tabloid. The first tabloid came out around the same time. It was called the New England Current. And this guy, John Williams, was just writing, for that day. But who the person behind the New England Current was James Franklin, Ben Franklin's brother. And so already at this time, these guys are like saving all of these people from, and by the way, it wasn't called vaccination at that time. It was called variolization, because variola was the name of the smallpox. Was the actual name of smallpox in medical speak at the time. But what you can see is that what they're saying is arguments proving that inoculating the smallpox is not in the law of physics. It is not natural or divine, and therefore it is unlawful. So God does not want you to do this. And this is probably the first real anti-vaccination campaign. Now, later on, the reason it became called vaccination is because the Spanish or Latin word vaca comes from the cow. So it was all about smallpox. It wasn't about measles or mumps or rubella or, polio or anything like that. It was all about smallpox. And basically what they found was that they could do an even better job if instead of taking a human's smallpox and putting a little bit of it on the skin of a healthy person, that would prevent it. If instead they took some of a similar disease in cows called cowpox. And so that's why they changed it from a variola to a vaccine. Variolization to vaccination. And then here you can see in about 1800, here is a political cartoon where physicians with horns are feeding children to a beast called the vaccinator. And the beast is made of plague and leprosy and, that kind of thing. Even though they were sort of saving, like thousands of times as many lives as they were having, problems or something like that. But this is, what you can do with a, sort of information campaign or misinformation. Okay, you guys remember that there was that big difference between 2001 in terms of vaccine acceptance and 2015. Well, what happened in the middle? This guy happened in the middle. So this is Andrew Wakefield. And I apologize for those of you who do not know the story, but I do have to tell the story for people who do know. So Andrew Wakefield was a gastroenterologist. He was not an autism expert or anything like that, but he believed that something in the MMR vaccine may have caused autism. And what he did was he wrote a paper that ended up in a really big medical journal, The Lancet, and it was 12, that involved 12 kids. And he basically said, oh my gosh, there are 12 kids that I've seen in my practice. And these kids, they got immunized for the measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine. And then a few months later, they got autism. And there's no way statistically this could be an accident. It later turned out that he fabricated the data. It later turned out that he did what's called Texas sharpshooting. Texas sharpshooting is when you shoot at the back of a barn, and then after you've shot, you put the targets where, so what he did was he looked out of thousands and thousands of kids for 12 that he found where there was a temporal, association. Now, he created an entire sort of, misinformation, well, really disinformation campaign, including creating a documentary. And then all of a sudden, the medical community had to produce basically hundreds of studies showing that this was not true. Published in JAMA, the top medical journal, published in Pediatrics, the top pediatric journal, the Archives of Disease. Here's a few more of the studies that they had to produce showing that there was absolutely no statistical, connection. I mean, millions and millions of dollars to try to, and that there was there also were all of these different arguments for why, well, maybe it's thimerosal, a particular, chemical that was in there. But, then scientists proved that it's not thimerosal. It's not mercury. It's not that you have many vaccines at the same time. Here's a few more studies. The bottom line is that the reason that he was able to find these 12 kids who had a temporal association is because if you look at, just the natural history of autism, when do you find out that someone is autistic? Well, about 12 to 18 months of age. And when do we give the MMR vaccine? 12 to 15 months. If this was a different disease that just happened to, occur at that time, in other words, kids got autism at this exact same time, well before there were any vaccines, well before there was thimerosal, well before. So what this is like is, you can easily show, for example, that as ice cream sales go up, so does drowning. So ice cream must cause drowning. Or maybe people who drown, like their relatives, buy more ice cream, I guess. No, the reason why ice cream sales are correlated with drowning is that both happen in the summer. So this is a perfect example of, why, I understand because I have patients in this, world. When people, have a kid who starts getting the symptoms of autism and they, and they say, oh my gosh, they got a vaccine a few months ago, or they've read this book, which was by one of those celebrities that, maybe not quite as popular as Ariana Grande, but, and a physician who also has been, questioned about, methods and that type of thing, that it is very, very understandably emotional and compelling to parents who are looking for some kind of, smoking gun. The problem is that map that we saw of what Little Rock would look like and what this would look like here if all of a sudden people didn't get vaccines. And here is a tweet from someone that I think we all know from 2014. So this is before presidency. Healthy young child goes to doctor, gets pumped with massive shot of many vaccines, doesn't feel good and changes, autism, many such cases. It's retweeted. So here is the Agora, but it's not just I'm telling a friend in the Agora, I'm telling 9,000 people who are telling 9,000 people who are telling 9,000 people. And this is exactly, the sort of what has been shown over and over again by medical science to be wrong, but these people don't have Twitter followings. These people do not have Twitter followings like this one. Okay, so now let's come to COVID. So we have this connected world that is upping the ante. We have heard so much about vaccine hesitancy and COVID. Most people are not going to get it. 2/3 say that they would not accept it. What if schools require it? 1 in 3 Americans would not get it. If 30 to 60% of Americans would take this coronavirus vaccine, then the exponential spread will stop, et cetera, et cetera. Well, I think, first of all, let's slice and dice these data just a little bit. So one is, it's interesting that it is different in different countries, for example, and the US is kind of right in the middle of the pack. And you can find all these data, from these sources. So in the United States, for example, the number of people that say that they will take a vaccine if it's safe and effective at this point is about 75%. It's almost 90% in China, and it's in the 50s in Russia. So it's just interesting that, culturally, there are a lot of differences for, various reasons. And some of these also probably have to do with how badly, the epidemic was in their country. Although, you see Italy here below the United States, even though Italy had just, a horrible initial period. France did as well. India, obviously. I think, though, this was actually published before the big India surge. So this might be different now. Here is what people who are worried about the vaccine are worried about. So here, I am concerned about possible side effects. And, there are some side effects to this vaccine because it does activate the immune system. And so when your immune system is activated, that can make you feel sick. Now, in terms of a side effect that is actually, deadly or a problem, there have been literally none, with the millions of cases of, vaccines that have been given. So this is a very interesting thing is, how do we as public health people deal with this? Do we say there's nothing wrong with feeling a little sick for a day when, this thing has killed 600,000 Americans, I don't know. This is a sort of a puzzle. This is why public health is challenging the way it is. And it's about the science, but it's also about marketing. I plan to wait, see if it is safe and may get it later. How many millions of people will need to get it? But you can always cook something up. You can always say, well, maybe people vaccinated will get something 20 years from now. I don't know. I obviously got my vaccines, and everyone in my family got their vaccines, including my 14-year-old who was just allowed to last week. But this is that whole thing about the awkwardness of, information. I don't trust COVID-19 vaccines. I think other people need it more than I do. That's interesting. I don't know if a COVID-19 vaccine will work. I am concerned about having an allergic reaction. 30% of people that don't get the vaccine say, I think I would get an allergic reaction, even though we've seen basically, again, none. I mean, maybe very mild kinds of things, but this mRNA vaccine, which I won't go into too much. Hopefully you guys have a biology person who's telling you a little bit more about that, but they are pretty amazing in terms of them not being, immunogenic giving you an allergic reaction. I don't trust the government. I don't believe I need a vaccine. I don't like vaccines. My doctor has not recommended it. I'm concerned about the cost, even though it's free, etc. Okay. What about looking at the demographics of folks? So this orange is definitely will not, and red is probably will not. So you can see that overall, we have between definitely and probably will not about a third, 32%. And then the gray is probably will. This blue is definitely will. And then the green is already has received, because this was conducted about 4 months ago.
Yeah.
So, so what you can see is what are the groups with the most orange red? Republican, independent, not a college graduate, and then interestingly, 30 to 44. Older people, more likely, maybe, more concerned about morbidity. Younger people, more likely. Democrats and college graduates. So anyway, this gives some ideas about sort of tailoring messages, which is one of those things that we do in public health, or we at least try to do. Another thing that's very interesting is this. We see, I'm not sure, or no, I'm not going to, much more among the African-American population and the Latinx population. And then we see about the same things as we saw before in terms of partisanship and ages. But why do we see this? Well, I think it's very important that everybody understand why we see this, because it comes from somewhere very, very real. And hopefully I'm just repeating something that you've already heard, because this is a critical piece of American history. But if not, you need to know about the Tuskegee Study. So the Tuskegee Study was conducted in Tuskegee, Alabama, at what was the Tuskegee Institute from 1932 to 1972. And it was a grant from the federal government. So the federal government knew what was happening, but it was being conducted by the Tuskegee Institute. And what was happening is there was a terrible disease that a lot of people were getting called syphilis. It was a sexually transmitted infection. And what the people did, I'm just going to, give you some of the real stats so that you know this and can look it up more yourself, or do your own independent study if this is something you didn't know about and are interested in learning more about. It involved 600 African-American men who were mostly very poor sharecroppers. About 400 of them had syphilis and 200 did not have syphilis. And what they did during this 40-year period is they just studied individuals and looked and saw what the natural history of the disease is. Now, what made this such a tremendous ethical abuse is that all treatment was withheld. In 1947, it was shown, for definite that you give people a shot of penicillin, the syphilis is all dead. But they continued to study people until 1972, even though there was a perfectly good treatment that just could have, and some of the, some of the things that it caused were brain damage, death. I mean, this wasn't like, oh, let's just see if the scar gets bigger, They also disguised placebos as treatment. They're like, here, we're going to give you this thing. But it was actually a placebo. Oh, geez, I'm sorry that didn't work. Finally, in 1997, for the first time in history since 1972, someone from the government, and he was the president at the time, apologized on behalf of the U.S. government and to the victims, and said that this was a shameful and racist study. But that lives on. This is going to forever be something that we need to understand. And it's not just the Tuskegee study either. There are other, that we don't have time to go into, but there have been other, major abuses of African Americans and Latinx populations in research studies in the past. And so when we say, hey, the government wants everybody to get vaccinated, it is quite natural that we are going to see, some reticence. Okay. Today, the anti-vax community is in tremendous force. This is Robert F. Kennedy Jr. He is the nephew of John F. Kennedy. And he is absolutely certain that the vaccines are deadly, that Fauci is, trying to kill us all, etc. There are actually only about 12 major anti-vaccination individuals like this, but because of the infodemic, we see how quickly the information can get to different places. And in fact, for example, the most popular Johnson & Johnson vaccine story on Facebook was not a real story. It wasn't something that actually came out of like, oh, look, the vaccine is effective. It came from one of those 12 conspiracy theorists. And there have been a bunch of studies that have basically shown that often misinformation and disinformation travels more quickly through social networks than real information. And part of that is because, oh, look, it's surprising, it's shocking, it's weird, it's different than what we would normally expect. And so it almost makes sense that it's going to be the less correct things that spread the most rapidly. But what a bizarre thing we have to do in the public health world and in the communication world. Here is one of those anti-vaccine activists. And just take a look at this tweet for a moment. This is, 5 months ago. So this guy just sort of created the idea of a vaccine. I mean, what if instead of a vaccine, we were able to get exposed to a weak version of the virus, which is exactly what this vaccine is. And in fact, it's not just weakened, it's totally paralyzed. All it is it's the instructions to make the spike protein on top so that your body can learn to kill the spike protein when COVID actually comes in. So get exposed to a weak version of the virus that enabled us to build the antibodies. We need to fight the real thing. That's exactly what ends up happening is this gets retweeted and we get this word vaccine is somehow evil, even though what he's describing is vaccine. So this is, communication. Facebook pages, it's very, very easy to, find a beautiful stock photo of a, gorgeous kid and, put in a friendly font, stop mandatory vaccination, to use words like mandatory that, people don't like being forced to do anything, the perversion of herd immunity. This is eloquently explained by Dr. Andrew Wakefield, who is the person that we spoke about before. Okay, so finally, what's next? Well, what can we do about this? Well, we can try to have campaigns. We can say, look, guys, fake news is kind of like a virus, so be really careful, pause, take care before you share. But is this really going to work for the people who are spreading the, misinformation? I'm not so sure. We can try to promote media literacy. right now in schools, all 50 US states have media literacy somewhere in the curriculum. In other words, this is, teaching kids to analyze and evaluate what they see, whether it's in a Shakespeare poem or whether it's in a beer advertisement or whether it is somebody's post. So when they look at somebody that says, I just heard firsthand that a doctor who had coronavirus recovered in double quick time, he inhaled steam, just as we normally would in a bowl with a towel. Steaming raises the temperature of the lungs. How do we teach people to analyze and evaluate things like this? Because, we don't know. I mean, I guess that could be right. It's not, and raising the temperature of the lungs and inhaling steam can actually be, damaging to the lungs and problematic. But you can see how, even though media literacy is something that we definitely do, and it's something that we definitely should do, we should teach people to, analyze and to ask those questions, like what's being omitted from this, or who posted this, and let me find out other things about that person and what they're making money from. Let me find out what they're connected to otherwise. What's the source of this information? What's the target audience of this information? What techniques are they using? Are they using, words that are particular, for a particular reason? Are they using a particular image for a particular reason, et cetera, et cetera? Here is another example of, what would a media literacy person do here? Well, they would look at this and say, okay, what is vactruth.com? Let me understand a little bit more about where this message is coming from. Let me look at vaccineliberationarmy.com and find out a little bit more about who is, running this. I point out that, like, you see these shots, and you see there's they added like little red marks to kind of make it that much more violent. They put this in places where we do not vaccinate kids. These days, a lot of kids don't even cry during vaccinations because the needles are so small. When I see things like this, it's just, I wonder if all vaccines were instead given as gummy bears, would there be a difference? Is it something about bodily integrity? But it's a very, very powerful thing. And when people have a different, I don't know, when people have a different perspective, they, are very able to take pictures like this, create them, manipulate them. We can also try to understand the health behavior that I was talking to before. We don't want to have the same message for everybody. In other words, the idea is not to go, sort of blue in the face, trying to get people who have never said they've refused all vaccines for their entire life and try to get them here. The purpose is really to look for these people in the middle and just to move them forward on the continuum. That is a much more effective kind of strategy. It's kind of like someone, who smokes 3 packs a day and has never, ever thought of stopping smoking cigarettes. I'm not going to go to that person and say, so Bob, let's set your quit date. How about setting your quit date for next Monday? Well, that's stupid. That's not going to work, right? What we need to do with that person who is what we call pre-contemplative is just move them into contemplation, even thinking about it. The person in contemplation, we need to just move forward into maybe a little bit more contemplation, or maybe preparation. Okay, what could we do to kind of, clean out the ashtrays, or, something like that. So by understanding health behavior, we can also try to be a little bit more effective. We can also recognize that everyone who refuses vaccines is not the same. So this study was conducted by one of my students in public health. And what she did was an analysis of 800 anti-vaccination individuals who were blocked, whose messages were so problematic for some reason that Facebook actually blocked them, and wanted to sort of say, well, what were their networks like? Who were these people? Well, many were parents, many were female. 55% were pro-Trump, but 11% were pro-Bernie. So we're seeing very different markets. And even though this video that was argued against by all of these individuals was posted in Pittsburgh, there were messages from 38 states or 36 states in 8 different countries. And then this is really what she did, which is so cool. She used some statistical modeling to find out who was connected to who and what kinds of messages they were doing. And she found that there were sort of 4 major completely different messages. There was this mistrust message, like, well, we really shouldn't trust doctors. There was this, the orange here is all about chemicals and homeopathy and personal stories about someone who was harmed. And these folks were sort of the nature lovers. And these were the Bernie supporters too. And so the bottom line is, whereas the liberty people, vaccination is a violation of civil liberties, media censorship and cover up, these were the pro-Trump individuals. So there are very, very different messages that we might want to give. Whereas the people in green, they were much more concerned about harm. So really, they just needed to be educated. Some people need this, some people need this, some people need this. It's like totally different. So for example, how would we tailor a message to the nature people? Well, this was one of the pictures that a nature person, posted, saying, why are my kids always sick? Well, it's because of the chemicals in Coca-Cola. It's because the chemicals in, McDonald's food. It's because of the GMOs. And it's because they pumped my kid full of shots. So here, what we realize, these people are concerned about chemicals. So maybe we can message to them that really what vaccination does is boosts a natural immunity. So we use that term natural that we know, it is something that these people care about and is the truth. The mistrust group we're also concerned about UFOs, and we're concerned about government cover-ups and tell the truth about Roswell. And for those people, we can, say, hey, did you know that anti-vaxxers are actually making a lot of money off these books? Hey, did you know that the anti-vaxxers are actually trying to sell some very expensive therapies that have never been proven to work? Et cetera, sort of to lever the mistrust. And then, there's other, possibilities. I want to leave some time for, but, the point is we can tailor to the harm group, we can tailor to the liberty group. And that is something that we need to think about. I think physicians and other, sort of public health people need to be active on social media. A lot of us are not. When I looked up my Facebook thing, like Dr. Aloya suggested, it was 0. And I guess I just didn't really use it a lot this week. I don't never use it, but anyway. But should we be more active on social media and try to understand subgroups? Probably so. There's also a bunch of entertainment narratives. If you think about it, millions of people watch Madam Secretary, for example, just as an example of a show. And so so the CDC actually got involved and used Madam Secretary as a way of getting out a storyline related to vaccine refusal and misinformation. And so there's kind of creative stuff like this that public health people are doing. So this is what we talked about today. I would love to hear your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to both of you for 2 fantastic presentations. We had a lot of great student questions for today, but I want to open up with each student is assigned different days to be doing blogs on, and the student who will be writing about today is Lauren Multi, and she had 2 fantastic questions. So Lauren, I want to open up the floor for you to ask both of your questions.
Okay, so I'll start off with one. The first one is, it has been pointed out that fake news and inaccurate information may spread faster than fact-based news. How can we avoid this kind of misinformation, and what are some things to look for when reading information from a certain source? What were the major negative impacts of social media misinformation on this pandemic?
Yeah, well, Lauren, those are huge questions. Those are great questions. I guess what I would say is that like I pointed out, it is a terrible irony, right? That harmful messaging and incorrect messaging is going to spread faster. We just need to be aware of that. I mean, that's one thing. And think about it this way. If like we created a TV show or that was like all about kind of just the everyday, like people in an emergency room, when I did my emergency room rotations in medical school, I thought everything was going to look like ER, with people running in and running out, and the music would be piping in, full symphony orchestra. Well, that did not happen. It's mostly people just kind of sitting there, and there's beeping from the other room. Well, you don't see that because that's not going to sell anything, right? It's not going to make people terrified or capture their imagination. So unfortunately, that is just a reality that public health people like you, I know you're in public health, and I am as well, are just going to have to deal with. Is, we are often behind the 8 ball because we can't lie. Budweiser can put out a campaign and they can imply that drinking beer will make you more virile, when in fact, alcohol is the #1 cause of erectile dysfunction in primary care. And so, they can just sort of do whatever they want. They're not really being, whereas we're bound by ethics, and we can't do a campaign to say, hey, take your blood pressure medicine every day because it'll make you more virile. We can't lie that way. We can't. And so what you've identified here is, I don't have an answer for you. But you've identified the key question that we chip away at, every day. The second and last thing that I want to say, though, is related to, what can we do to help people? And I just want to reinforce that idea of media literacy, because media literacy is something that I do think we could study more. Let me just give you like 6 questions that somebody can ask about, any message, whether it's a beer ad, whether it's a tweet from a celebrity about COVID vaccination or whatever. So number 1, and this is a mnemonic that I created and have written about, and the mnemonic is added up. The A stands for author. Who made this and why did they make it? Look into that a little bit. So kids, like, for example, when we do this kind of thing with kids, they love this because they love finding out a little bit. Oh my gosh, look at how much money this person's making from XYZ. Kids don't like being manipulated. And so this is why this is probably a better way than us wagging our fingers at kids and saying, you shouldn't do that. You really shouldn't smoke. Instead, wow, look at this. The person who made this ad, who's the CEO of the company, made $67 million last year. How long would it take for the average person in the United States to make $67 million if they work at McDonald's? Oh, 7,000 years. Wow, fascinating. So A, who is the author? D, who is it directed at? So who is because every message has an author and an audience. And so who is this really being directed at can often, uncover some interesting things. The I is what kind of ideas are they trying to get across? Because it's often not as much facts as it is like feelings and ideas and, sort of, bigger kind of concepts. The T in add it up is what specific techniques are they using? Are they using a particular font, a particular color, a particular lighting scheme, a particular meme, to make it look in a particular way? Have they curated their page in this way? The U is critical. It's what's unspoken, what's left out of this message. You might be saying, oh, look, there was one, here's, one person who had to be given medicine because they had an allergic reaction to the vaccine. Well, the unspoken is, well, how many people have the thousands or the millions of vaccines saved? And so then all of a sudden that kid can go try to figure that out. And then the P is, what's my plan from here? In other words, we're not forcing people to don't believe this, believe this. What's my plan in terms of how am I going to get more information? How am I going to become more empowered? And what decisions am I going to make for myself? So it's one little idea. I'm sorry, I can't solve all of those things right now, but wonderful questions.
I'm going to go ahead and ask your second question, Lauren.
Yeah, that actually was very good. Thank you for that. The second question I asked was, this pandemic has caused damage that goes beyond the physical ailments of disease. So alongside the physical medical implications of COVID-19, the mental health of many have also taken a toll. And I was wondering if you think that there could be a mental health crisis following this pandemic, or are we already facing it?
Yeah, so not only are we already facing it, we were already facing it before the pandemic. So I don't know if you know this, but a few years ago, England created a post for the Minister of Loneliness. Look it up. Google Minister of Loneliness. Like normally, ministers are for national security and housing and things like that. The suicide rate in the United States is the highest it's been in 30 years. And this is before the pandemic. Depression and anxiety are at the highest levels that we've seen in a long time. So, and the pandemic has really only exacerbated this. And so, you're absolutely right. And this is what I was saying is I saw the question, and I was, I'm sorry we don't have more time to talk about it in terms of, some of these, thoughts, but there's no question that we are now in a new pandemic of loneliness, of fear, of isolation, of depression, of anxiety, of sleep problems, and all of these things, they all twist on each other. And mental health, it can't be exaggerated, just what a crisis it is right now. It would take, an entire couple more hours to talk about the specific ways and the specific possible things that we do. But I think if at the very least, we come away understanding that we already were in a huge crisis of mental health in not just the United States, but the world. Let me give you one last statistic, and then I want to, give Dr. Aloya a chance to also, weigh in on this, because I think there are so many communication aspects that would be useful to hear about. The number one cause of disability in the world is now depression. I'll say that again. The number one cause of disability in the world. So if you Google World Health Organization, disability, biggest cause, you can put in depression, but you don't have to because it's going to come up. This was about 4 years ago now. They came out with a report. What was it before that? Before that, it was musculoskeletal injuries, right? Because disability is your back, you break your back, you break your leg, you can't whatever. And now depression is actually mental health is actually the number one cause of disability in the world. So we are in that new pandemic.
Lauren, I think you bring up something really important and related to the second article, in that, yes, we see a mental health crisis continuing, as Dean Primack mentions, that it's not necessarily started as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, but it has certainly escalated the mental health crisis that we see. I think another thing to also think about are other indicators of health as well. So I think typically we think about physical health, mental health. People now have been talking more about as a result of this crisis. But I think we also want to think about social health and environmental health and spiritual health and financial health also, which have all also been negatively impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. The article gives us some hope, right, in that we see support also becoming available on social media as a result of our quarantine, right? That people are going to social media to look for informational support, emotional support, etc. And so that gives us some indication that maybe there is hope for ways that we could use these social media resources to also help mitigate some of the negative effects on all of our indicators of health. But I think also we want to think more generally, more broadly about how we consider health and all of those facets of health that have been negatively impacted.
We are past time, but if both of you are willing and able, can we squeeze in 2 more questions? Isabella Stark has a great follow-up on this on social media and individual mental health.
Yes, so my question was, how can individuals recognize when social media is affecting their mental health? And what are some signs to look for, things to consider?
I think this is it is an excellent question, Isabella, and a challenging one to answer too, because it requires a lot of self-reflection. And I think sometimes our use of social media becomes such habit that we are not necessarily very critical of our own usage. I imagine that some of you, when you opened that Facebook app and you looked at how much time you spend on Facebook during the day, were probably surprised to see the number to be as high as perhaps it might be. And I think that's because a lot of it happens in a less aware way, in a more habit way. And then to be able to recognize that that habit might have negative implications for your mental health is challenging. I think having a system of support around you to let you know if that might be happening. But I think there are so many things that contribute right now to poor mental health that it's hard to pinpoint whether the cause be necessarily social media. And so also thinking about your behaviors more generally, being reflective on what brings joy and happiness, what allows you to feel connected to other people, I think is one way to kind of think critically about the ways that you can improve your mental health.
So just to piggyback on that a little bit, Isabella, it's a great question because a lot of people don't really have that insight in terms of, people say like, oh, I'll know if I'm depressed because of this thing. I'll know if I'm anxious because of this. But, as Dr. Aloya is sort of showing, it's so integrated into our lives that it becomes really, really hard to know. So I would say 2 things. One is, you could try a bit of a cleanse, a couple days without and see what it's like. There was actually a big study that did this. It took, and it showed that the people after 1 week of not using social media felt significantly better about their life in general and all these other things. But before that, they didn't feel like they had a problem. So sometimes it's only when you stop taking the medicine that you can be like, oh my gosh, I feel better, or something like that. I mean, and I don't know what the answer would be for you. It may not be. It may be no. My quality of life went down this week when I wasn't using it. So it's not to say that it's in any one direction. It's just to say that is one thing that we do, whether we're in medicine. If we're trying to figure out if like a supplement is harming you, and you don't really know if it is or not, we say, well, let's try without it for a week and see what happens. So you can do the same thing with social media. Last thing that I'll say is that one big thing that you can think of is quote unquote addiction. So there are several things that define addiction in the medical realm, and sometimes people find it a little bit easier to reflect on these things than they do on just straight old depression, anxiety, loneliness, etc. So one is if you use something even though it's causing you problems in some way or another. So, this is where, like, someone who's misusing alcohol, they really need to study for the test, but they go ahead and go drinking instead, and then they do badly on the test. So it's worth it to sort of be introspective about that whole idea, is like, are there other things that are more important to my mission for myself as a human, that I am doing less of because of these things? Or is social media helping me do my mission? But again, that's very introspective, because you have to sort of come up with a mission statement. You have to sort of think of, what is important to me. And so, so anyway, that's one thing to think about, related to addiction.
And one last question from Jessica Hansen that's almost a counterfactual, asking about what if the traditional media, radio, newspapers still had their formal authority. Jessica?
Yeah, my question was, do you think that if radio and newspapers were still a part of the mainstream media as a source of information, that there would not have been such a large toll on people's mental health during the pandemic?
So I think the gatekeeping that happens in traditional media is productive, right? But traditional media is also slow. And so when things do change, as Dean Primack mentioned, it takes some time before we would hear about that in a traditional sense. And so I don't want to demonize social media, because there are a lot of benefits that we receive as a result of a faster news cycle that happens because of social media that we don't get in traditional news cycles. And so I think it's important to think about both the benefits and the costs of the changing in the news cycle. And I think, honestly, that perhaps the benefits outweigh the costs of mis and disinformation, as Dean Primack talked about earlier.
Yeah. So just real quickly, and then just to sort of expand on that, but because I totally agree. Someone once asked me, so what would you rather have, the Encyclopedia Britannica or Wikipedia? The Encyclopedia Britannica is like, someone has researched every little fact and they've put everything in there, whatever. Whereas Wikipedia is like, you don't necessarily know where the information came from. But it's, but it's very updated and, et cetera, et cetera. I actually said I would rather have Wikipedia. Mm-hmm. Because the thing is, like, I don't really know who researched this, but I don't really necessarily know who researched it for the Encyclopedia Britannica either. And that person also has a perspective, and as the historian in the room can tell us, you always need to know what perspective it is that someone is coming from. And so in a lot of ways, this is sort of piggybacking on what Dr. Aloya was saying about, like, social media isn't necessarily, sort of inherently bad. It's just that it, unfortunately can propagate, sort of challenging messages that maybe aren't quite as helpful. The only other thing that I was going to add is that it's also increasingly difficult to disentangle what is new media, social media, and what is traditional media, because we don't really have traditional newspapers anymore. I mean, we do, but they're online. They have their own Twitter accounts. Like, I mean, everything is a little bit, a lot of social media links to, traditional media. And so it's just to say that your question is very, very good. And something that even complicates your question a little bit more is the fact that they're so intertwined these days that it becomes hard to know where one stops and another one starts.
And we have so many more good questions and no time for audience questions even today. This was a fantastic session. And as is our custom in vaccine, we are over time. We haven't had a single day we weren't because the exchange has been that good. Professor Aloya, Dean Primack, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today. And everyone, be sure to join us tomorrow when Ashley Milburn from Industrial Engineering will be talking about logistics and the vaccine. See you all tomorrow at 10 a.m.